Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, caribou, icons of the Arctic, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Anthony Mallinson. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Take it away, Anthony.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob, for that great introduction. And hello, and thanks to everyone for being here today to learn about caribou with me. So, as Rob mentioned, my name is Anthony, and I am one of NatHab's Canadian expedition leaders. And I am excited to talk to you about one of my favorite deer species. You see, I've titled this presentation "Icons of the Arctic" because caribou are truly ice age survivors. They've been in North America a very, very long time, evolving alongside other megafauna like cave bears, giant beavers, and mammoths. And when I think of the Arctic, caribou are one of those truly quintessential animals that come to mind. Hopefully, by the end of today's talk, you'll learn just how well adapted these animals are to a life in the cold and how truly special they really are. All right, so today I just want to start with a brief introduction of myself. We're going to move on to talking about caribou right after that. We're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of caribou, the life history, and some of the different subspecies of caribou we have, how caribou and northern culture are really intricately linked, and some of the more pressing conservation concerns we have with caribou. After that, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how we can see caribou with NatHab, and then, like Rob mentioned, we'll have a chance to go into a question and answer period. We only have about 45 minutes together, so some of these topics we won't be able to do a really deep dive. It'll be more of a crash course in caribou, but just know that if you have any further follow-up questions, I'd be happy to answer those. Or if you come on a trip with NatHab in Caribou Country, you can always ask your lovely expedition leader. So a little bit about myself, a really quick introduction. I was born in the Pacific Northwest, just outside of Vancouver City, and that's still where I spend a lot of my time guiding on the west coast of British Columbia. Although I currently live in a small little mountain town with my wife and our pet cat and dog. My educational background is environmental science and geology, and I've also studied glaciology at the University of Stockholm and salmon and wildlife ecology here in British Columbia. For the past 7 years, I've been working as a wilderness guide and naturalist. And now with NatHab, I work mostly out of Churchill, Manitoba, where I lead polar bear viewing trips and Northern Lights adventures in the winter. Actually, just got back yesterday from my first trip of the season. It was a really wonderful time. Heading back up tomorrow to Churchill, so I thought it'd be a great time to squeeze in this webinar. And it's been some beautiful trips. So I'm talking to you now from the Fort Garry in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory. If you've had the pleasure of joining us on one of our beluga, Northern Lights, or polar bear adventures, you would have probably stayed in this same hotel here. So it's great to see so many people online today to learn about caribou and how truly special they are. So I want to throw this photo in here. I took this photo in 2013. This is the first time I ever had the pleasure of seeing caribou. I was traveling back, finished my undergraduate out in Nova Scotia at Dalhousie University, and my wife and I were traveling back across the country. We decided to take a little bit of a round route. We ended up spending about a month in Newfoundland, traveling up through Labrador, and we saw this small herd of caribou in an area called Grossmoor National Park in Newfoundland. We pulled over to the side of the road, and I'll never forget it. It was a pretty powerful moment and really started my love of caribou. Pretty exciting. In 2025, NatHab is launching trips to Newfoundland and Labrador, and you'll actually have the opportunity to see caribou there with them. So just before we get started, I wanted to clear some things up about naming. The scientific name for caribou and reindeer is Rangifer tarundus. And the use of the terms reindeer and caribou for essentially the same animal might cause a little bit of confusion, but the issue is actually quite simple, and that's that caribou cannot fly. So in reality, reindeer is actually the European name for the species of Rangifer, while in North America, the Rangifer species are known as caribou. They're essentially the same species, and if given the opportunity, they could and they would interbreed. These animals have been separated for as long as the Bering Land Bridge has been submerged, so about 15,000 years ago following the retreat of the last ice age. The word caribou we borrow from the Indigenous Mi'kmaq word calibou, which means snow shoveler, and refers to the habit of the animal of pawing through the snow to reach its food underneath. Reindeer, we can further differentiate by the fact that they've been domesticated for about 5,000 years. In Eurasia, the indigenous peoples of the Altai Mountains and the Sami people were the first to start domesticating caribou. And there's still a lot of groups of these people, communities that depend on domesticated reindeer for food, transportation, and income. Caribou domestication was never present here in North America, but our indigenous groups would move the caribou seasonally or take advantage as they migrated past, and caribou were really essential for all aspects of life here in the northern parts of North America. So in general today, reindeer are a little bit smaller, a little bit calmer, have less inclinations to migration. There's about 3 million domesticated reindeer still around, and a number of small herds of wild reindeer that we get in parts of Europe. This presentation will focus primarily on caribou, of which numbers range. There's around 2.5 to 3 million caribou that are wild and free here in North America. To complicate things even more, there are small populations of reindeer that have been introduced to North America. Up until about the 1930s, reindeer were introduced to the Inuit and other northern indigenous groups in Alaska and northern Canada in an attempt to introduce that reindeer herding lifestyle to some of our indigenous peoples. Small populations of these animals can still be found in parts of Alaska and in areas of northern Canada, and extremely difficult to tell those animals apart, especially to the untrained eye. I've even had the opportunity to talk with seasoned Indigenous hunters that are out there hunting caribou. They have a difficult time telling the animals apart. They say if you're accidentally out there hunting a reindeer, as soon as it hits the ground, it becomes a caribou. So we'll move on, talk a little bit about caribou evolution. Caribou are one of 5 members of the family Cervidae that we have in Canada and the US. The other members being the moose, the elk, the white-tailed deer, and the mule deer. Arguably, the black-tailed deer and other subspecies of deer may qualify as their own species. But in general, these are the 5 species of deer that we have in Canada and the United States. The ancestors of caribou walked out of South America about 5 million years ago and appear to have speciated or radiated and spread out in what we call Beringia. So that's the far Pacific Northwest, eastern Siberia area there, the Bering Sea. And from there, that's where caribou spread across the north, and they're now found in what we call a circumpolar distribution. It's really this interglacial cycle of the last 2 million years that had a really major influence on the evolution of caribou, and in fact on the evolution of a lot of other Arctic and subarctic species. The caribou that emerged after the last glacial epoch are really forged by snow and ice. And we'll see they're quite impervious to the cold and very well adapted for some of these epic migrations across the north. And of all the deer species in the world, caribou are by far the most well adapted for these cold Arctic climates. We know the earliest caribou fossils from Alaska are about 1.8 million years old. From the Yukon, we have fossils ranging back from about 1.6 million years. And we can safely assume that caribou have been in North America for a very, very long time, about 2 million years, which is quite astounding. If we contrast that with some other well-known animals, like our bison species, it's been about 200,000 years, muskox even less. And then if we look at animals like the moose, they came over after the last ice age, so they've only been in North America about 15,000 years. So opposed to some of those other megafauna that they would have evolved with during the ice age, so things like giant sloth, mammoths, cave bears, giant beavers, caribou are actually able to survive those several glacial advances and retreats during what we call the Pleistocene glaciation. So the last 300,000 years of glaciation, really tell us a lot about our modern day caribou. And we roughly divide our modern day caribou still into 2 broad categories, that being the barren ground caribou, which we find in more northern areas, and boreal or woodland caribou, which we find in more forested areas. And this division is really intimately linked, like I said, to that fluctuation of the climate, those advances and retreats of the last ice age. So around 300,000 years ago, during quite a relatively warm interglacial period, caribou expanded through the northern half of North America. Huge areas of land would have been exposed as the glaciers retreated, creating really ideal pasture and foraging areas for these caribou, and the populations would have thrived and really expanded. However, when temperatures began to cool again, glaciers once again started to grow across Canada and the northern parts of Alaska and northern parts of the US. the expansive caribou range was split in two, essentially isolating these two populations. And they became really quite distinct. So there would be populations living on the northern edge of the continental ice sheets in that Beringia area, and those living in a really thin margin of suitable habitat along the southern edge of the ice sheet and in areas of what we call glacial refugia. So here in North America, we really still broadly divide our caribou into those two different ecotypes, those that live above the Arctic tree line, which we call the barren ground caribou, and those that live within the forest, often, but not always boreal forest, which we call woodland or boreal caribou. They have distinct differences in life history and different adaptations that we'll discuss a little bit later on. So this image here doesn't show that 300,000 year ago glaciation. It's showing a more recent glaciation, what we call the last glacial maximum, starting about 100,000 years ago and going to about 18,000 years ago. But the idea is really the same, and you can see how the suitable habitat for caribou would have disappeared as more ice continued to grow, and it would separate those two distinct populations. Today, caribou are found, as I said, circumpolar. That means across the northern parts of the world. They're found in forests, they're found in mountain terrain, and we see them out on the tundra. In Canada and US, you can see the historical range of the caribou here and their current present range, which is quite drastically reduced from that historical extent. Officially, we have 7 subspecies of caribou. So we have 2 reindeer subspecies, which we won't discuss. We have 4 barren ground subspecies and 1 woodland caribou subspecies. But this is rapidly changing with new research. For example, the Labrador and Newfoundland subspecies, there's calls to classify them as their own species. And like many other modern division of species, this division is criticized as being too simple, as they're really distinct populations within these broad categories that exhibit completely unique life histories. So for example, within the woodland caribou, we have populations of mountain caribou that are highly endangered and live quite sedentary lives in the temperate rainforests near the Rocky Mountains. And we also have populations of George River caribou living over in Labrador and northern Quebec that migrate thousands and thousands of kilometers annually. So quite different life histories and still considered the same subspecies of animal. So although caribou are one of the largest of the deer species, they're quite short and stocky, and they're really well built for those cold weather environments. There's great variation among the different subspecies in terms of weight, as well as seasonally, as some males can lose about 40% of their weight during the winter. But on average, males typically weigh about 350 to 400 pounds, with females coming in about 180 to 260 pounds. They have extremely broad muzzles that are completely covered in fur, and unique to deer, both males and females grow antlers. They have massive snowshoe-like hooves, and like I mentioned, they partake in these epic annual migrations, some of the longest terrestrial migrations that we have here on Earth. Caribou typically live about 10 to 15 years, but males rarely live really more than 10 years, as they expend so much energy during the breeding season, or what we call the rut. And like I mentioned, all this time living around ice in this highly seasonal northern climate has really caused the caribou, in particular those barren ground caribou that we find above the Arctic tree line, those ones that are isolated above the ice sheet originally, to evolve these amazing adaptations to life in the cold. So like I mentioned, this will be more of a crash course. We're going to focus on 6 key adaptations quickly. So that will include this remarkable counter-current heat exchange system, which caribou actually share with a lot of other northern species, as well as talking about the caribou's incredibly well-adapted muzzle, their amazing adaptations in their pelt, some adaptations in their hooves, their antlers, and the amazing eyesight that they have. So first I want to talk about this heat exchange system. Like I mentioned, a lot of other Arctic animals and birds have also developed this complex system of heat exchange that we call counter-current heat exchange. At its most basic, it involves warm blood moving into the extremities that's being cooled by blood returning to the body. And this is a really highly efficient means of minimizing heat loss through the skin surface. So in cold weather, arteries that carry warm blood are quite closely knotted and intertwined, as we can see in the image there, with veins returning to the body that are carrying cold blood, causing that warm blood to exchange heat with the cold blood in the veins. If we look at the image on the left, we can see that heat is exchanged between the arteries and the veins before it leaves the animal system. The image on the right really shows the impact of this. So while the legs of the caribou can be quite cool, the body temperature is significantly warmer. So when it's negative 31 outside Celsius, and I apologize for my American friends, a caribou can maintain its core body temperature to about 40 degrees, which is really quite incredible. The heart doesn't have to pump blood as rapidly to maintain that constant body temperature or that metabolic rate. So it's an amazing adaptation they have. Lots of other animals share this adaptation, like our very well-known megafauna, like polar bears, all the way down to some of the most well-known cold weather survivalists, like the Arctic fox. A lot of birds use the same system to keep their feet from completely freezing off, and rodents like beavers and muskrat that drag those tails across the ice are also using an incredibly similar system. The next adaptation I want to discuss was the muzzle of the caribou. So I already mentioned caribou have that really broad, elongated muzzle. It's completely covered in fur. So unlike other deer species, aside from the moose, their muzzle is completely covered in fur and really quite well insulated. They have these specialized noses featuring what we call nasal turbinate bones. And those bones dramatically increase the surface area within the nostril itself. That large muzzle also allows for more volume in the nasal cavity and really helps warm and humidify cold air before it reaches the lungs as the animals breathe in. And as they breathe out, it also strips the warm air of heat and moisture. So it's a really efficient way of retaining heat and moisture within the animal system. And really quite incredible. In less than a single second, this system can alter air temperature by nearly 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, I find, absolutely incredible. The pelt of the caribou is incredibly well adapted as well. So like many other Arctic animals, the caribou actually have 2 layers of fur. So a very dense kind of woolly undercoat of fur that's quite insulating, and then a longer overcoat of hollow air-filled hairs. The Inuit in Canada would always prefer harvesting caribou in the late summer, as the coat has thickened up at that time, and it would be perfect for winter clothing, incredibly insulating clothing, and used in Indigenous cultures across the north. Fur is the primary insulating factor that caribou use to regulate their core body temperature in relation to their environment, and those hollow hairs also really help improve the buoyancy of the animal. So caribou are incredibly efficient swimmers. They can swim up to about 6 miles an hour. And adults and 2-month-old calves have been documented in northern Canada swimming about 1.5 miles between islands to reach their calving grounds or different foraging areas. So this is a caribou hair seen at about 300 times magnification, and you can really see that distinctive open cellular structure of the hair. You can see how much air that would trap, you can see how insulating that would be, and you can really tell how much buoyancy that might be able to provide. The hooves of caribou are also quite unique amongst a lot of other deer, and that really has to do with that huge varied amount of terrain that they're traveling over in these really epic migrations, thousands and thousands of kilometers. So they have some of the largest hooves of all deer species, measuring in at about 5 by 8 inches. So absolutely massive footprint. This gives them the lowest foot loading of any cervid. So it's about 4 times lower than that of a moose. Really great at distributing the weight of the animal. So they also can adapt these to the season. You can imagine the tundra in the summer is going to be soft, it's going to be muddy, it's going to be wet. So the foot pads actually spread out, become quite sponge-like, and act almost like a snowshoe in the mud. In the winter, the opposite happens. The pads shrink, they contract, they tighten up, and they really help the animal cut through snow and ice, prevent them from slipping, and help them access food that's buried beneath the snow as well. We'll talk about some of their favorite food as we go on in the presentation. The antlers of caribou are incredibly intricate, especially when we compare them to other deer species around the world. And caribou are the only deer in the world where both male and females will grow antlers. This isn't the case of all subspecies of caribou, but in general, both male and female caribou will grow antlers. So like all other deer we have in North America, caribou have the ability to regrow these antlers annually. The primary purpose being to establish a dominance hierarchy, particularly during that breeding season, or what we call the rut. And caribou also use these antlers to access food buried underneath the snow. The antlers grown by females are smaller, a little bit more irregular than the males, and it's mostly the female barren ground caribou that grow them. And it's thought that it provides them an advantage, feeding advantage during the cold, harsh winter, because the males will actually drop those large antlers right after the fall rut, and it relieves them of a lot of weight. These antlers can weigh over 30 pounds, about 35 pounds, about 10% of the animal's weight. So you can imagine if they're no longer needed, it's a really great way to save energy getting rid of these antlers. Females will actually keep their antlers in the spring, helps them protecting food sources from other animals, also helps them access a little bit of that food source in winter. Female antlers really only getting about 7 or 8 pounds. That antler cycle begins each spring. It's triggered often by an increase in daylight, with males beginning to grow antlers generally in March, females a little bit later in June. Calves begin growing antlers about 1 month after they're born in the early summer. The new antlers are often encased in a soft skin that we call velvet, and that supplies blood and nutrients to the antlers as they grow, and they can grow incredibly fast. So these are some of the fastest growing bones on the planet. Only takes about 120 days to get that full huge rack. So growing about 2.5 inches a day, which is really quite incredible. So by midsummer, they've got that fully grown rack. The antlers will harden throughout the summer. The velvet dries out. In the fall, these hormonal responses to changes in daylight again really trigger a testosterone spike in the bulls, and they begin to peel that velvet off in late August. The females typically waiting a little bit longer to peel the velvet off until about October. The antlers will get bigger and bigger each year for the animal, particularly for the males. And this is typically after reaching a peak breeding size of about 4 to 5 years. Then they'll begin to devote more and more nutrients to antler growth to better compete with some of those other males for their right to breed. So you might already be thinking it, but on a more fun note, now that we know that male caribou lose their antlers before winter really sets in, it becomes quite apparent that all of Santa's reindeer were actually female reindeer. So the final adaptation I wanted to talk about, quite an amazing one, is the eyes and the eyesight of caribou. So as humans, we understand that everyone sees slightly differently. We all might see different colors, slight variations in our vision. But as a very visual creature, I find it really hard to comprehend that there are ways of seeing the world that are not even possible to us. So I can understand that I can't hear in certain ranges. I can't hear certain things that whales can hear. I can't smell certain things that bears can smell. But being able to see in a completely different spectrum of light is really hard to comprehend. In 2011, a study revealed that caribou, like a lot of other mammals and birds, we're discovering more and more constantly, can actually see in the ultraviolet range. So it's thought that this ability helps them to survive in the Arctic because many objects that blend into the landscape in light visible to humans, such as urine or fur or lichen, stand out most likely in UV. So the image on the left is taken from a paper examining caribou eyesight, and the research suggests that the caribou likely see these white wolves as black against that snowy backdrop, certainly an advantage in avoiding predation. In 2023, another paper suggested that this adaptation further helps caribou locate lichen that's buried underneath snow. That lichen would be kind of UV absorbing lichen versus the snow that would be reflecting that UV. So quite amazing adaptations. And another feature of their eyesight is they actually change with the seasons. So if we look at the image on the right, during the perpetual darkness, you can imagine 24 hours of darkness for some of these caribou that are living up in the high Arctic or up in northern Alaska and places like that, their eyes become quite a lot more sensitive to light. So like most mammals, caribou have what we call a light reflecting layer of tissue that we call the tapetum lucidium. And this gives the animal better vision in low light. So during sunny months, caribou have that yellow eye shine in the top right corner there. But in the wintertime, their eyes take on this bluish sheen, and their pupils are constantly dilated, which increases fluid pressure in the eye and really makes the caribou eyesight about 100 to 1,000 times more light sensitive. So if we combine this with the ability to see in UV, we know that caribou have excellent eyesight an excellent ability at avoiding predation and finding food sources underneath the snow. So I'll keep moving on, just wary of time. Those are some of the adaptations of caribou, amazing adaptations. These animals have evolved over millions of years of living in this glacial, interglacial cycles that we've talked about. So now that we've learned about some of those, I want to talk a little bit about the life history, what a year in the life of a caribou looks like, focus mostly on barren ground caribou. And we'll remember there are those two broad ecotypes of caribou. So we have the migratory barren ground caribou that live in those treeless tundra environments, like this herd pictured here. This is the Bathurst herd, which I had the pleasure of paddling past a few years ago. And then we have the boreal woodland caribou, which in general, not always, have much smaller ranges. And then to complicate things further, we have a special type of caribou within that boreal woodland caribou called mountain caribou, which you might have heard of, incredibly endangered animals right now. Well-known ecotype of caribou. They live in the temperate rainforest west of the Canadian Rockies. The range used to extend down into the US, but the animals have been extirpated from there. And these caribou migrate seasonally from alpine to low-level elevations, but they generally stay in quite small ranges. It makes them a lot more susceptible to habitat degradation and changes with the changing climate. So spring is really a time of movement for caribou. You can imagine the harsh winter is starting to lift, the snow is starting to melt, you have easier access to food, new and fresh types of vegetation. You've been eating lichen all winter, so you're a little bit excited about some of this new vegetation that's emerging. Barren ground caribou actually exhibit some of the longest terrestrial migrations on Earth to reach those summer ranges, which provide access to important foraging resources. They begin to migrate from their wintering areas northward toward their calving grounds, typically starting in March and April, with pregnant cows often leading the way in their urgency to reach those calving grounds. Most adult cows are pregnant every year. They give birth to one calf, with twins being quite rare. They follow trails that have been used for thousands of years to reach areas that are either typically quite productive or perhaps areas that are typically free of snow earlier than other areas. Today, traditional routes are being disturbed by changing climate. As you can imagine, rivers and lakes that were previously frozen now become obstacles that caribou have to cross, and vegetation along the route itself is changing as the climate is changing, and that affects the caribou as they're migrating. Calving typically occurs during a 3-week period from late May to mid-June in the northern Arctic. If there's been delays along the migration route itself, calves may be born en route, but they can typically walk within about 1 to 2 hours. And although they're more susceptible to predation, just a number of days after being born, they can travel about 10 miles a day and easily start to keep up with the rest of the herd. The first weeks of life are the most dangerous, as with most species. Predation can be quite high, mostly by wolves, grizzly bears, wolverine, golden eagles. And caribou's strategy to avoid this is to swamp predators. And what I mean by this is the cows in a herd give birth to a lot of calves in a very, very short period of time. This essentially overwhelms the predators in the area with an overabundance of food. So predators and scavengers are also quite quick to target stillborn or unhealthy calves. We call this synchronized calving, and it's a predator avoidance strategy that's employed by a lot of other herd animals around the world. Caribou end up walking a lot. So they basically eat and walk. Sometimes it seems like their head is down, they're munching away, and their feet are just constantly in motion. Their body is just following along. So for example, some of the Western Arctic caribou herd up there in the northern parts of Alaska, on average, walk about 2,000 miles a year, with the longest individual female that had been tracked walking about 2,700 miles in a single season, or in a single year, my apologies. This constant walking also helps to degrade areas of forage. So when caribou come across areas of prime forage, they often don't spend the entire time feeding on it. They'll move through that area and retain that area for the following year. So this image here involved tracking about 1,000 caribou over about 20 years. And the timing of the migration, when the caribou depart those wintering ranges and start heading north for those calving grounds and those summer foraging grounds, was really thought to depend on factors like snow melt and availability of vegetation for forage. But what the researchers actually observed over this long study is at the start of that spring migration, each year is generally synchronized amongst all herds across the continent, which is quite amazing. And this coordinated departure in March or April seems to be primarily dependent on large-scale climatic cycles and not really on those small, more localized factors like snow or vegetation or daylight. Once they reach those calving grounds, caribou really spend the entire summer feeding. So summer is an incredibly important time for a caribou, and it's a time to take advantage of abundant vegetation and fatten up for that fall breeding season and that harsh winter that's about to come really quite quickly. It's also, unfortunately for caribou, a time of very intense harassment by insects, and that harassment can really constrain the foraging opportunities. So they really need to maximize those opportunities. It's a very short Arctic summer. They need to regain those body stores that they've lost during the previous winter, during the migration, and amass stores for the upcoming winter and the upcoming breeding season as well. So in early summer, caribou are eating the leaves of willows, they're eating sedges, they're eating flowering tundra plants, mushrooms, which provide a lot more protein than the lichens that they've been eating all winter and all spring. They switch back to lichen, dried sedges, and small shrubs like blueberries again in the fall and late summer. In midsummer, caribou form what we call post-calving aggregations, which are really dense groups of animals. And this is an attempt to reduce that really intense harassment caused by mosquitoes, botflies, and warbleflies. These groups can sometimes number in the tens of thousands of animals, with some populations tending to stay near the coast, where bugs may be kept at bay by winds and things like that, or some animals heading up into the high mountains, where cooler temperatures might also limit insect populations. In August and September, when the insect harassment, the disturbance is finally beginning to decrease a little bit, this allows the caribou more opportunities to focus on feeding. So after those insect numbers decline, caribou scatter out. They feed heavily on willows, leaves, mushrooms, things like that to regain their body weight. And they break into smaller bands and slowly move across the tundra towards the tree line or along the coast. They're rapidly gaining weight, and cows in particular have to gain enough weight to be able to breed in the fall. Researchers have long speculated that this climate-driven greening of the Arctic, so to say, may actually benefit barren ground caribou, providing earlier forage and better summer foraging opportunities. But we're actually seeing in recent years is a stark decline in a lot of our barren ground populations. So caribou typically have a diet very low in protein during the winter, like I said, eating those lichens. And protein is most abundant in this newly emergent vegetation, declining below maintenance levels after midsummer. So if caribou arrive late, it can be very, very detrimental. They can miss that peak foraging and really hit the peak insect harassment. So the arrival of caribou at those calving grounds also really depends on weather conditions and insect populations the previous year. So a buggy summer this year can mean a delayed arrival at the calving grounds next spring, which in turn can cause caribou to miss that prime new vegetation, miss opportunities for really bulking up with that protein. So warm and windless are really not conditions that favor caribou. And we can get an idea of how much climate can affect vegetation if we look at the image on the right here. This is from the North Slope of Alaska, satellite imagery. The top image is available protein or digestible nitrogen from the period of the 25th of June to the 1st of July in a year which had a very early spring. And the bottom panel depicts that same area, the same available protein during the same week in 2018, which was a year with a very late spring. The purple being the general location of the herd at the time. And it just shows how drastically those foraging areas can be impacted by a slight change in climate. And you can see if caribou are arriving at different times, they might miss that peak feeding opportunity. Oh, this photo always gets me. So we'll take a second. We'll talk about insect harassment. I don't know if you've had the chance to be in a wonderful Arctic environment in the summer like this one. Most of my experiences have been intense. And I can tell you, getting out of your tent into a world filled with mosquitoes is quite unpleasant. Everything is done in haste, it seems. And no one's really talking or having a really great time. We estimate there are about 17 trillion mosquitoes in the state of Alaska alone. That's about 96 million pounds of flying insects buzzing around you. And caribou can lose about 4.4 pounds of blood every single year just from mosquitoes alone. So during midsummer, when temperatures peak, harassment by mosquitoes and by flies can really, really strongly influence the behavior of caribou. Harassment's been associated with reduced time spent foraging, increased time spent walking and running, and moving to areas that are cooler, windier, and often have less ideal foraging or less ideal forage. So given these effects, summers with greater insect harassment have been correlated with reduced calf weight and a reduced adult body condition. Researchers have also concluded that caribou reproductive rates decrease following summers predicted to have greater mosquito activity. And abundant protein in the Arctic, like we've talked about, is quite limited and happens to overlap with this peak harassment period. And that can really compound the issue year after year. So if the caribou miss those foraging opportunities, the summers continue to get warmer, insect harassment increases, and it can be a really compounding effect. And even small reductions in summer foraging can have really cascading effects on caribou body condition and subsequently the demographic rate as well. So aside from our wonderful mosquitoes, warble flies and botflies are a constant pest to caribou. The warble fly picture the bottom left, the botflies bottom right. Both these insects have a life history straight from science fiction horror movies. So the warble fly lays its eggs on the legs of the caribou. And once those eggs hatch, the larvae penetrate the skin and slowly over the summer into the winter, they'll crawl up the leg of the animal, make their way to the rump, to the back of the animal, cut a little breathing hole. And by early summer, they're about 1 inch long. They're ready to emerge. They come out of the back of the poor animal, fall to the ground where they pupate, emerge as an adult fly, buzz around the caribou, only really living long enough to mate and to lay eggs on the caribou again. They actually live they have such a short lifespan. The adult flies don't even have mouth parts to feed. So truly horrific animals. The botfly, another really terrible, terrible insect, horrific pest to the caribou. This starts as a larvae on the caribou's nose, crawls into the mouth and into the caribou's sinuses, all the way up into the back of the throat, where they spend the winter. In a really heavy infestation, there could be up to 50 botflies living in the throat of a caribou. Obviously, you can imagine this can cause a lot of distress for the animal. A lot of caribou have a chronic cough, pneumonia-like symptoms, and in rare cases and in intense infestations, this can cause suffocation as well. In the spring, these larvae detach themselves, leave through the nostrils, falling to the ground, causing a lot of distress to the animal. And just the swarming and harassment by the warble and the botflies, accompanied by the constant buzzing of other insects, can be very, very disturbing to the caribou. It causes them to run around at times, lose body condition, stop feeding. And personally, I've seen caribou that look like they're running from just invisible tormentors, or caribou that are standing up to their heads in water, trying as well as they can to avoid any harassment from insects. I put a personal video in here. We'll see if this one works.
Hey, caribou. Hello. Hey. Don't know if this guy could see us.
All right, that was the lovely voice of my wife there. We were on a paddling trip up in the Canadian Arctic, and happened to pull our kayaks up on shore, and this caribou was booking at full speed right down the tide line, straight towards us. We know now from what we've learned, the caribou could probably see us quite well, but he was just in this completely frenzied state, trying to run away from invisible insect harassers. We had a really good look, see if there were any bears or anything else that were following the caribou, but it was likely these warble and botflies that were buzzing in the animal's ears, causing them to just run erratically along the beaches. So after that summer of foraging and avoiding harassment from insects as best as they can, caribou are really ready for the cooler temperatures of fall. Males have increased their weight by about 20% between just July and September. Their neck doubles in girth. They put about 3 inches of fat on their rump, and they grow a really, really thick mane, all in preparation for that breeding season and the rut. So during September, the males begin to engage in somewhat friendly sparring events, testing out those new antlers, gaining strength, sizing each other up, getting a little bit of technique for that coming rut. And some caribou end up moving to special rutting areas, but most also rut within their summer range itself. So male caribou are capable of breeding, and female caribou, by about 1.5 years of age. But it typically is a little bit longer until they're actually large enough to contest some of those bigger males for breeding rates. So it's usually around 4 to 5 years of age when the bulls are becoming active breeders, as their body size and their antlers are now large enough to compete. Caribou are polygamous. So barren ground caribou form kind of loose tended groups of females, while boreal or woodland caribou often form harems with mature males able to defend about 10 females and calves. Typically, the herd bull will allow males and even some other, male calves and even some young males, 1 to 2, 3 years of age, to stay within that group of females just because they're not really intimidated by them at all. So like many other mammals, when another bull approaches, posturing is often enough to convince one of them to back down. If not, and they're closely matched, a fight is going to take place, a very violent fight. Once they're about a few feet apart, they'll tip their antlers forward, smashing their tops together, and a fight will occur. Often this doesn't last longer than a few minutes, but even this has the potential to tear skin, to break ribs, to shatter bones, and really puts both of those animals at risk of predation or even a fatal injury. The dominant male is going to be mating with multiple females. The females come into estrus, just checking the time, the females come into estrus slowly and remain in peak breeding estrus for about 48 hours when they'll mate with several males. They'll mate several times with the dominant male. My apologies. As she comes into estrus, her interest with the bull slowly develops gradually, and each day, as her hormones increase, she'll devote more and more attention to that male. As the female comes closer to estrus, the pheromones in her urine change and really alert that male that she's reaching that peak estrus period. And most cows in the herd end up being bred within a few days of each other, allowing for that synchronized calving and that swamping of predators that we talked about a little bit earlier. So as temperatures continue to cool, caribou begin that long migration back to their wintering grounds. If there's above seasonally average temperatures or really good weather or access to forage along the way, the caribou will delay as long as possible, continuing to feed before starting that migration back to their wintering grounds. Caribou, like we've talked about, incredibly well adapted to a life in the cold and a life in the winter. So it actually gives them an advantage in the winter. They can withstand temperatures colder than a lot of other animals and spend time in areas of deep snow with those big snowshoe-like hooves to avoid predation in the winter as well. The distribution of barren ground caribou is really constantly changing during the winter as the herd is searching for places where the food is most abundant and the snow is a little bit more shallow and easier to access food underneath. Caribou are using that excellent sense of smell and that UV vision and some of their excellent other senses to detect that lichen underneath the snow with those broad hooves designed for digging these what we call feeding craters through the snow and ice. Lichens are really the mainstay of their diet through the winter, but sedges and other evergreen leaves are also eaten. We've talked a few times about lichens, so I'd be ashamed not to talk about it a little bit more. This is the primary food source of caribou and reindeer around the world. This is reindeer lichen, named because of its association, but also because it looks like little reindeer antlers. And while the caribou don't only eat lichen, they're definitely an abundant and really preferred food source in much of their range, with reindeer lichen being one of the most abundant. It's really lichen that's key for the winter survival of both reindeer and caribou. Lichen is not actually a plant, it's a composite organism. So it's formed by the symbiotic relationship between a fungi and an algae, with the fungi providing the structure and the algae providing energy through photosynthesis. This relationship really allows lichen to withstand extreme cold, extreme drought, and we find it in every caribou range. We find it on rocks, hanging from trees, and spread out across the tundra as well. The abundance of lichen is really directly linked to the abundance of caribou. Lichen is really high in carbohydrates, but like we've mentioned, it lacks significantly in protein. So caribou need to acquire that in fresh grazing areas in the spring. I'm not sure if you've ever tried lichen. I've only ever had one lichen I really enjoyed. Up here in Churchill, we have a lot of edible lichens, but they're quite nutrient poor. So caribou often have to eat about 7 pounds of lichen daily. There's some famous Arctic explorers that had to rely on eating rock tripe, but it was so nutrient poor, they actually had to boil their boots in order to survive as well. Caribou have a slight advantage over humans in that they've evolved a process called rumination. This is not unique to caribou, and it really helps them extract every piece of nutrient from their food. So they tear that lichen and swallow it almost whole and then regurgitate it in this partially digested cud, grinding it through their back molars. This process is quite time consuming, and caribou often take small naps or little rests during the process of rumination, and they can be quite vulnerable to predation at this time. So they're often in very protected areas or areas with very good visibility. It helps them really squeeze every last bit of energy from that food. And like a lot of other deer species and ungulates, they have a 4-chambered stomach as well that helps them break down and extract even more every last bit of nutrient from that food. So aside from insects, which we already covered, caribou face constant predation from other large predators. Spring, the calving season, is when they're most vulnerable. So wolves have evolved alongside caribou through successive ice ages, with each species forcing selection of the fastest offspring. And the life cycle of these two species are still closely intertwined, still as wolves follow caribou herds for often hundreds of miles. They can be hard to intercept, and while wolves could bring down large adults, they're typically hunting the rear guard of the group, those animals that are a little bit too weak or injured, or calves that might have been born early. And that's where they're going after most of the animals. Grizzly and black bear also prey on caribou where their ranges overlap, like here in northern Manitoba. But they are primarily targeting calves as well. I've witnessed barren ground grizzly running down mature caribou, so it does happen as well, but it's not as common. And then more recently, and perhaps of interest to those folks that have joined us up in Churchill, polar bears have recently been observed predating on reindeer. So particularly in the Svalbard region during the summers, as that sea ice habitat continues to degrade. I have another image there. As that habitat continues to degrade, polar bears are actually chasing reindeer into the water where they have an advantage over them. They can hunt them down in the water, drag them out of the water, and feed on them. But even more recently, I took this image off of Instagram. A photographer I follow, Florian Ledoux, my apologies, has been observing a number of bears over the past couple of years, working with BBC and Nat Geo, and he's actually working with a bear he names the Grinch, and he has seen the Grinch running down caribou in the middle of winter over hunts that last a couple of hours, which is really pretty amazing. First time this behavior has been observed, and it's likely changing climate might be forcing these animals into different situations where they're forced to adapt to different prey species. Because they have existed for so long and are spread across the circumpolar north, caribou and reindeer really form the basis of most Arctic and subarctic cultures, and most human life in the north would not be possible without caribou. So use of caribou included meat, hides for tents, clothing, footwear, fat for cooking and light, and then using bones and antlers for a myriad of different implements, from snow knives to shovels to drying rats to hunting tools, used in art and carvings as well. And we find the remains of caribou actually accompanying most Paleolithic dwelling sites in Europe, including some sites that are over 40,000 years old. And in North America, there's evidence linking humans and caribou back as far as 20,000 years. So indigenous hunters in North America and Europe depended on that annual caribou migration, and ancient settlements were often constructed right along those migration routes. If these groups missed the migration, they would often face starvation. So historically, indigenous hunters would spear caribou as they crossed waterways or at natural choke points. They would lie in wait, hidden in the bushes in their kayak. And once the herd was committed to the river and couldn't flee, couldn't turn back because there's so many animals behind them, the hunters would strike. And in this way, they could often harvest hundreds of animals at the same time, the carcasses floating downstream, and they'd collect them at a later date. Other techniques might involve running caribou off of a rocky outcrop, or in the case of a woodland caribou, they'd be funneled into corrals through handmade drive lanes made of stone or brush. So here we have a sonar image on the right of a prehistoric kill site in the waters of Lake Huron. This was discovered in 2014. It's about 9,000 years old. At that time, the last remnants of the Ice Age still held enough ice that they had not yet filled that Great Lake system. This would have been all above water level. The water levels were much lower at the time. These resident kind of Stone Age hunters would anticipate the appearance of the caribou annually at this site and constructed this drive lane at the choke points with rocks piled into these parallel berms. V-shaped blinds were set up along the sides to guide the approaching animals, and as the herd passed, women and children would emerge behind them and force the caribou into the corral where they'd be trapped. This hunting was often done in cooperation with other groups along the migration route, and that bounty would be shared. So in this way, the fortunate community would harvest much more than they required and share the game with others, knowing that in times of need, if the caribou migration route changed slightly, if there was other unforeseen circumstances like changes in weather and they missed that migration, they'd actually be able to benefit by other groups harvesting caribou as well. So I mentioned we're mostly talking about caribou, but as important as caribou were for the Indigenous people of North America, equally valued in Eurasia. So reindeer, like I mentioned, first domesticated in Europe and Russia about 5,000 years ago by the Sami people and the people of the Altai Mountains. And reindeer herding is still quite integral to their culture. And today there's about 3 million domesticated reindeer living in Northern Europe. Traditionally, reindeer used for the same uses we use in North America: milk, skins, furs, and blood to make blood sausages, sinews for the sleds. And Sami would use the antlers for knife handles and tools, and they'd even use the reindeer for transportation. So it's incredible to look at these photos from about 125 years ago of traditional reindeer herders. Everything from the tents to the clothing to the backpacks is made of caribou. So they're really taking advantage of every part of the animal. Today, things have changed a little bit, as most caribou herding is typically done by helicopter or off-road vehicle or snow machine. So we have a few minutes left here. Oh, my apologies. We'll talk about some of the conservation concerns of caribou, and then we'll save some time for questions as well. So across the Arctic and subarctic, caribou are really the lifeblood of many Indigenous cultures, and they play a key role in Arctic ecosystems through grazing and fertilizing and supporting predator populations. While there have often been natural significant fluctuations in caribou populations, right now there's a large concern about the rate and the extent of caribou decline really across the world. So in the last 150 years, caribou have lost more than half of their traditional range to land use change, and what is left continues to be highly degraded. Oil and gas projects, road building, pollution, pipelines, and changing climate are really, really devastating caribou habitat. Many First Nations have actually moved to outright bans on harvesting, or they're working with government and researchers to restrict annual harvests. Warmer weather is promoting the growth of woodier vegetation that's really inferior forage for caribou, who need an abundance of those protein-rich plants. Tundra greening is happening early, like we talked about, so that by the time the herds arrive in the spring, the plants have passed that foraging prime, resulting in overall reduced foraging quality. And warmer climate, as we discussed, also means more of those lovely biting bugs, which really, really impact caribou health. Changes in sea ice are also affecting movement of animals in the far north. You can see those subspecies of caribou living in the high Arctic, and that can really inhibit the movements of some of the herds as they move back to their winter grounds or as they move to some of their calving grounds in the spring. One of the largest concerns regarding changing climate is the formation of these ice lenses or crusts of ice over the ground. Caribou find it difficult or impossible to smash through these layers to reach the vegetation below, and these freeze-thaw events are really becoming more common in the Arctic as the climate continues to warm, and they can lead to mass starvation. So in 2019, over 60,000 reindeer starved to death as they couldn't break through the ice to reach their forage below. Anecdotally, I've also talked to researchers who have witnessed wolves traveling very easily over these ice lenses. So caribou having a hard time accessing that forage, punching through this ice, cutting up their shins, having a really difficult time, and wolves having a very easy time making their way across and increasing predation on animals. The movement of these large herds is also becoming unpredictable. So structural changes to the landscape, you can well imagine things are melting, permafrost is melting, rivers and lakes are changing their courses, as well as changes in vegetation, combining that with an increase in storms, particularly during the spring and the fall when the animals are migrating, as well as an increase in heat waves and forest fires, have made some of the herd movements completely unpredictable. Decreasing ice as well often leads to more open water crossings and more energy used during the migration. Some of the numbers that we're seeing I find really hard to believe. So the George River herd, which I've mentioned a few times, over in northern Labrador and Quebec, from a peak of nearly 800,000 animals down to 5,000 animals. Or the struggling Bathurst herd, which we saw that image of earlier, an estimated 470,000 animals in 1986, down to just 8,200 animals in 2018. Quite staggering population collapses. Woodland caribou have slightly different concerns. This research in 2021 showed that caribou were more likely to be predated on when they were closer to pipelines, seismic lines, or streams, features which predators use to travel, especially in the winter. In Canada, scientists have declared the endangered woodland caribou the greatest terrestrial conservation challenge in North America. These animals are severely impacted by changes to the climate, due in part to be more closely tied to a habitat that cannot shift as rapidly. Woodland caribou declined further than barren ground caribou as well due to differences in their life history. For example, larger groups of barren ground caribou can buffer against impacts of climate change or predator distribution. Vast tracts of boreal forest are also disappearing quite rapidly, with Canada clear-cutting about 1 million acres of forest annually, a lot of it, unfortunately, for toilet paper. So in the current climate crisis, this is more important than ever, as that boreal forest, as well as the permafrost that it's overlaying, is one of the largest carbon stores in the world. And it's often the presence of endangered woodland caribou that are preventing the wholesale plunder of this habitat. Fragmentation by logging has significantly altered the predator-prey dynamics of the ecosystem as well. And what I mean by this is every road that's pushed through provides predators with easier access to the herd safe zones. So as the areas continue to be degraded, other ungulates like moose and deer move in, attracting even more predators like wolves. So this increase in predation by wolves is simply unsustainable to a lot of these woodland caribou, in particular our mountain caribou. And a lot of these mountain caribou populations have just completely vanished. So scientists believe that the relying solely on habitat protection and recovery is ultimately going to fail. The extent of habitat destruction is simply too large, and we need to take emergency measures. So in British Columbia, for example, wolves are being actively culled in mountain caribou habitat, and we're also starting to build caribou maternity pens, like up in Jasper, and in areas of southern British Columbia as well. There's conservation breeding programs that are being used to prevent animal species from becoming extinct. And there is a little bit of success in these programs, but right now it seems like a little bit of a Band-Aid solution instead of addressing the root issue of habitat degradation and changing climate. A few more slides here, and then we'll get to a question and answer period. So with so many pressing concerns, what is being done to conserve caribou habitat? We know in Canada, in the last 30 years, we've seen about a 90% decline in a lot of our caribou species. So modern technology can really lend a hand here. Like with a lot of other wildlife research, it's becoming really key to assess the status of populations. AI provides accurate reports on herd size, condition, and location by using things like GPS tracking collars, especially starting to use drones. So drones can be really useful for vegetation studies, vegetation surveys like the one pictured here. They can scan the terrain and help map plant matter, understand changes to vegetation as the Arctic continues to warm. Drones can also gather information on herds in a very unobtrusive manner, unlike a plane or a helicopter that can be quite invasive, and they can take real-time census and record animal health and body condition. WWF is also working with local communities and researchers to better understand caribou migration and movements. A particular concern or a population of concern is the Dauphin and Union Strait herd, which traverses the frozen Dauphin and Union Strait to reach Victoria Island, where they raise their young before returning in the fall. With the Arctic warming, obviously the sea ice is forming later in the fall. It's thawing earlier in the spring. It's also not as reliable or thick enough, resulting in some caribou falling through and drowning on that 20 to 30 mile crossing. So to keep people and wildlife safe, there's advocating for the protection of this migratory pathway from things like ice-breaking ships that can really reduce that sea ice connectivity, as well as using AI to anticipate the timing, location, and risk of sea ice crossings for that Dauphin and Union Strait herd. We're supporting animal research to see how threatened herds are responding to disturbances, such as what we talked about, increased insect harassment and an increase in industrial activity and an increase in noise from those activities as well. So the main action you can take right now is simply to share this information. So share information about caribou, share that they're in peril, and their habitat is in danger of disappearing. Continue to learn about caribou for yourself, and pressure your local government for policies that protect caribou and limit industrial activity and land use change within their habitat, the main driver of population decline, particularly for our boreal caribou. When things seem a little bit overwhelming, I always like to reflect on an African proverb. If you think you're too small to make a difference, you haven't spent the night with a mosquito. So continue to support organizations like WWF and NatHab, and continue to support organizations that are really advocating for further protections and more research of these amazing animals. All right, I think I've taken it a little bit long there. I apologize, Rob. A question that you all might have after learning about these animals is where can I see them with Natural Habitat Adventures? So we don't have any trips that are specifically aimed at caribou viewing or encountering caribou, but we do have a number of trips that will take you to caribou country at the right time and put you in the right place to have a really good opportunity for seeing caribou. So it doesn't happen too often up here in Churchill, but just yesterday, some of our expedition leaders up there actually saw a caribou walking right past a sleeping polar bear. So pretty amazing. That's the Kamanieriak herd or the Cape Churchill herd. We have two different caribou herds here in the area. So always opportunity to see caribou up here in Churchill, particularly during the summer or during this early season right now in October during that polar bear season. So come on up here to Churchill, come check out our caribou up here as well as the polar bears. We also have itineraries in the Canadian Rockies, which pass through some of that mountain caribou, woodland caribou habitat, incredibly rare animals to see, but always an opportunity there. And then some of our programs in Denali as well. Super exciting though, and probably your best opportunity to see caribou with NatHab will be starting next year. And that's in 2025. We're launching a new trip to Newfoundland and Labrador. You'll remember that's the first place I had the opportunity to see caribou. So it's going to be one of your best opportunities of viewing with NatHab. Plus you'll get to see amazing wildlife out on the East Coast, puffins, bird colonies, whale watching, the root cellar capital of the world. So you really can't miss it. And it's a really great opportunity. So I hope to see you on one of those trips. I'm going to pass it back to Rob. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of opportunity for a question and answer. Thanks, everybody.
Anthony, thank you so much. Now, before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's grab some questions real quick. So, what sounds do the caribou make?
Yeah, they're not particularly vocal animals. They make little clucking and cooing sounds, but the main sound that I associate with caribou is actually a clicking sound. And that's a clicking sound that's coming from their tendons. And it's thought that the tendons, particularly right around their hooves, and it's thought that this might be an actual adaptation for caribou to stay together. So you can imagine these epic migrations that we've been talking about, these massive migrations over thousands of kilometers, constantly running into bad weather, poor visibility. And it's thought that this clicking sound might be an adaptation to help the caribou stay together. During the rut and the breeding season, the males are a little bit more vocal, but typically that clicking noise is the main noise that I associate when I'm thinking of caribou.
Great, thank you. So, do caribou sleep on their feet or do they lie down?
They definitely lie down. Especially during that rumination period, they're often taking these little brief naps, taking little sleeps, things like that. But caribou will find a safe place to lie down and snatch brief rests with other animals. It's typically going to be in an area, like an elevated area that offers really good visibility over the surrounding landscape, or an area that's quite sheltered and protected. I've seen caribou taking naps in little, almost like little caves along the coast, and these little nooks and crannies, areas that are going to be exposed to a lot of wind, a lot of breezes to keep those insects down, or maybe shaded areas that are a little bit cooler, particularly to avoid harassment from insects as well.
Great, thank you so much. So now, one of our guests is wondering did you say that elk are a type of caribou?
No, my apologies if there was a little miscommunication there. Elk are one of the 5 different species of cervidae or deer that we have here in the United States and Canada. So those 5 species, I can go back to that other image, or we can just talk as 5 species being moose, caribou, elk, white-tailed deer, and mule deer.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. So obviously the number of mosquitoes is pretty astonishing. Are there birds or anything that help mitigate this issue? Or is there any way other than jumping in the water?
Not really. Like there are a lot of animals up there feeding on the insect population up there, and the insects are really integral to that entire Arctic ecosystem. They do play a key role, but in terms of mitigating the harassment or limiting the number of insects, other animals don't really aid much. So really, the main strategies appear to just be getting into those cooler areas. So some caribou in central Alaska climbing up into more mountainous areas where it's going to be a little bit cooler, less bugs up in those higher alpine areas. Or like we talked about, caribou kind of spreading out along the coast where it's a lot windier, staying in those really exposed areas. In my personal experience, being up on the Arctic tundra, if you step even 20, 30, 40 feet off of the coast and you start stirring up those grasses in the tundra, the insect harassment increases dramatically. If you can manage to stay out on the coast where it's windier, things like that, insect harassment a lot less. Obviously not going to be the best foraging opportunities though, walking along the beach. So the caribou really have to balance that or find quite a balance there. And it can be quite difficult. But insect harassment is definitely kind of one of the main constraining constraints around foraging in the summer, and it's quite serious up there. I hope that doesn't put you off joining trips up here in Churchill in the summer. It is not as bad as that image I had on the screen, and it's often quite windy up here in Churchill, so we don't get that same insect harassment that we saw in that image there.
Is West Nile virus or the wasting disease a factor for the caribou?
From what I've read and to the extent of my knowledge, no. I can dig a little bit deeper and try and provide a more in-depth answer, but yeah, not to my knowledge.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. So is the Cape Bathurst herd mitigation route smaller than other herds due to the mountains?
The Cape Bathurst migration route. So Cape Bathurst, that like a lot of our caribou herds, the name of the herd is derived from their calving ground. So the Cape Bathurst herd calves in the Cape Bathurst area, which is just in the Western Canadian Arctic there. They do have quite a large migration route as well. And a lot of these caribou, even caribou in mountainous areas, like those ones that we were seeing, the Western Arctic herds in Denali and in the northern parts of Alaska, even in those mountainous areas, they can have quite extensive migrations in the realm of thousands and thousands of miles. The smaller migration routes that we see are typically within the boreal woodland caribou, and in particular those mountain caribou, which might not leave an area almost like a mountain range. They might stay within that one range their entire lives. They're traveling up and down more seasonally, so up into the alpine and then down to these lower level elevations, back and forth as the seasons change. And they might stay in that same area. They're going to be foraging in there during the summer and the spring, their breeding season. They're going to be in that same area, and their whole life cycle or their whole life history will be within that very small range. But typically those, like the Bathurst herd, a lot of those other barren ground caribou up higher in the Arctic are still undergoing a lot of those long range migrations.
Great. Thank you for that. Unfortunately, Anthony, that will be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for your closing comments.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate that. And thank you for everyone for spending some time with me today to learn about caribou. I hope we've all gained a little bit of appreciation for these special animals, and hopefully you get an opportunity to come view caribou with myself or some of our other wonderful expedition leaders. And you can ask any more questions that we didn't get an opportunity to ask when you come out on one of these trips. I hope everyone has a really great day. And thank you again, Rob. It's been an absolute pleasure. So back to you.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917 or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.